Young men in America are shifting to the right, young women to the left, but that divide goes far beyond politics. I'm Charity Nebbe. On the new season of the podcast Unsettled, we'll mind the gender gap in romance, education, health, and safety. Unsettled, a podcast from Iowa Public Radio, part of the NPR network. This is Garden Variety, a horticulture podcast from Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm Charity Nebbe. Here we are at the beginning of the growing season. We're enjoying an abundance of spring blossoms, and hope is abundant. This is also the time when the plant diseases we'll struggle with later on have their origins. But never fear, by understanding how plant diseases operate, you have a better shot at avoiding the worst effects. Here to help us understand how these diseases work is Chelsea Harbuck, plant disease diagnostician with the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic at Iowa State University. Hello, Chelsea.
Good morning, Charity.
Thanks for being here. And let's start with that. I mean, it's a big question, how diseases work, but give us some of the basics. When we think about plant disease, what is the cycle like?
So we like to start, well, at least when I learned plant diseases, we like to talk about plant diseases, plant pathogens, overwintering first. So the pathogens originate somewhere, and where they originate from depends on where the pathogens overwinter. And a lot of pathogens overwinter in plant debris, in the soil. Some of them are just soil-borne pathogens. And then they need some mechanism of dispersal in order to infect the present year's plants. So rain, wind, splash, etc., or even just like moving stuff around in the garden yourself, that presents the opportunity for pathogens to get to the plants where they can start to cause disease. But then usually most pathogens have this period of time between getting to a plant and when you see symptoms. We call it the latent period. So there's usually usually 7, sometimes as much as 20 days between when a pathogen gets to a plant, infects a plant, and when you start to see symptoms. So by the time we start to see symptoms on plants, usually the time for intervention has passed. And so that's why it's important to understand how plant diseases work, because a lot of times, and this happened a lot last year with how wet of a spring we had a lot of diseases showing up in the in the late spring and early summer, that once they showed up or appeared, there's nothing really we can do about them. And there are some diseases, that we do need to do stuff about, but then there's some diseases that we can just kind of tolerate too.
Right. We just watch things happen. So I think it'll help us understand this even better if you describe the disease triangle. What is that?
Yeah, so the plant disease triangle is one of the fundamental concepts in plant pathology and plant disease. And it's pretty basic, a triangle. We've got 3 sides. And basically what it is describing or depicting, if you can picture in your mind, are the 3 components that are necessary for disease to occur. So we have 3 sides. One side is a virulent pathogen, like pathogen that's able to cause disease. A susceptible plant, so a plant that is actually susceptible to that pathogen. And then the final side is a conducive environment. So the environment has to be conducive for the pathogen to grow and infect and cause disease on the plant. So we have to have all 3 of these things present at the same time for some duration of time in order for disease to actually occur. So if we remember the disease triangle, this also provides us a really useful tool to think about how to intervene in to limit or slow the spread or incidence of plant diseases. Because you take away one of those legs of the triangle, you are going to basically eliminate the opportunity for disease to occur. So if you have a history of a specific disease in your garden, think about what leg of the disease triangle can you remove to try and limit the incidence or occurrence of that disease in future years.
So that gives us some control because we do have some control really over all three legs of that triangle,
Yes.
although we have the most control over the favorable environment and the host plants, obviously.
Yeah. Yep.
But speaking about history of a disease in our garden, a lot of gardening years kind of run together in my memory. And I was just looking for something the other day that I thought, wasn't that last year? No, that was 4 years ago. So it's important to keep records of what's going on in your garden. And you just wrote a lovely column about this, but I think we all have the tendency of taking pictures and keeping some kind of record when things are going really, really well. But maybe we don't document the times when things are not going as well. So what's your advice for keeping records? Is it something that we should just be doing every year, no matter what?
Well, I think so. And I think it's made especially easy by the fact that most of us have cameras we carry around in our pockets. Just, whip out that phone. And as you're taking pictures, of course, like you said, you're going to be more likely to be taking pictures of the things that are particularly beautiful in the garden. But it's also pictures provide a really useful tool to go back and try and figure out when things started to go wrong. So as you start to see any sort of blemish or, thing that looks a little weird or not right in the garden, take pictures of that too. And take pictures not only of the plant that's affected, take pictures of the plants that are nearby, because these pictures are essentially documentation of the history of your garden or your landscape. And these pictures will provide for me, a diagnostician who really relies on so many clues outside of just the symptoms on the plant itself. It gives me the opportunity to look for patterns, and patterns are so useful when trying to figure out what is causing a plant to be sick, especially if I don't find any pathogens involved in the unhealthy plant tissue. The patterns will really help try or suss out what in the environment could be causing issues, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about taking pictures, which is kind of the easiest, the path of least resistance here. If you really want an A+ in gardening, I mean, you can really do better, right? You can keep a garden journal. What would you put in an ideal world? What would you put in your garden journal?
Well, so my garden journal would be like I'd have an album in my phone for the year because I have an Android, so I don't know if all of the operating systems have this option. I imagine they do, but with each picture I take, it documents the date. And then you also have the ability to add a caption to that picture. So you don't have to even do a written journal. You can have essentially like a photo journal that is an album for the year in your phone where you're documenting anything that comes up, or again, like anything that's particularly beautiful. If you have a cultivar of like pepper that worked particularly well, keep track of that too. These are useful records for many things that will, be helpful for the future of your garden.
Putting in planting dates, things like that. I mean, there's nothing to take a picture of usually when you put a seed in the ground. But is that a good idea too, to really document those planting dates so that you can keep track of things?
Yeah. So when we on our sample submission form in the clinic, we have all sorts of questions on the form, and I can't tell you how often many of the fields are left blank. And some of the fields that we have in there that are usually left blank are cultivar, our planting date, our like nutrient or fertilizer applications. All of these things are things that you can keep track of in a garden journal. And these are also things that are clues for when we're trying to figure out what could be going wrong with a plant if it becomes sick. So, yeah, where you otherwise don't get to document these things, like have like a, I don't know, physical evidence of what has happened in the garden. That's where making those notes when you're taking photos, or if there's some particular like weather event, like you can take a picture of that and document it. All of these things are really useful information when it comes to trying to figure out what is contributing to a lackluster crop.
So let's circle back around to that triangle, the disease triangle that we were talking about earlier. So once we have our records and we know what we've been through and we can remember where this disease was in our garden and what plants it affected, that helps us take control of that disease triangle, right? That gives us the opportunity to move plants around and change the environment.
That's just a thing. Yeah. So if you have like a watering practice that maybe results in an extreme amount of septoria leaf spot on your tomatoes, like keep track of that. And then you know that you need to change your watering practices in the future. Or if you have a cultivar of tomato that shows particularly poor defense to something like early blight. There are cultivars of tomatoes that have varying amounts of resistance to diseases like that. So you know that you want to look for cultivars that provide that kind of resistance, because oftentimes once a pathogen or disease is in your environment, you can implement cultural control tactics to try and limit the amount of disease in future years. But always the best method to me, and I think it's a favorite for most pathologists, for limiting the amount of disease you're going to see is going to be using resistant cultivars, which is, I know that there are like some favorite cultivars that people might have that might not be particularly resilient, but it is a good tool.
Chelsea Harbach is plant disease diagnostician with the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic at Iowa State University. There's a lot of good advice at the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic website, by the way, including how to take good photographs of plant problems. For more gardening information and tips, you can subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Find out more at iowapublicradio.org/garden. Garden Variety is a production of Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension. It's produced by me, Erin Stile, Caitlin Troutman, and the Iowa Public Radio talk show team. For more garden goodness, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Just go to iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. See you next time.